Hello and welcome to another Excel demo with Rich Kerr. In this scenario, we'll be taking a look at Excel's popular pivot table tool to analyze a range of data. So I've actually just set up some data here using Excel's ability to fill in data fairly quickly. So I've got 1,000 rows, or actually 10,000 rows of data here, and columns going out from A to I. You don't have to create this exact list. You can use an existing list, or if you don't have one, you can pause the video and make up a data set, and then start the video back, and we'll create our pivot table. Okay, so sometimes we have a data set that's large and varied enough that using tools like a regular Excel table or doing calculations with SUMIF or COUNTIF just aren't enough to give us the level of flexibility to slice and dice the data that we want. So a pivot table allows us to quickly take a large set of data and pull out subsections of it, analyze it, create different slices of the data fairly quickly without having to write any formulas, though you can add formulas to your pivot table to do even deeper analysis. In this particular video, we won't add any formulas. We'll do that in a second video related to calculations in your pivot tables. But we just want to get our essential pivot table rolling here. So I will go to the Insert tab since I'm inserting a pivot table into my workbook. And as long as my mouse is clicked somewhere within this body of contiguous data, when I click Pivot Table, a dialog box appears asking me to confirm that my data goes from cell A1 through I-10,001. And so I see the dancing ants going around the range that correspond to the range in this field here. And I do want my pivot table to go into a new worksheet. So I'll choose OK, and it takes me to an environment that looks like this. So the process of building the pivot table is about selecting the fields, which are made up of your column headings from the original data set. Which, side note here, all of your columns must have a header in order for the pivot table wizard to produce this initial setup. So if I did not have a heading at the top of each column in row 1, I'd have an issue here. So I'd like to do an analysis of each salesperson to see the quantity that they've sold. So I'll put a check mark on salesperson, and because that is a text-based field, Excel assumes that that's going to be one of the labels, and in fact the default is that it uses those as row labels. So each salesperson is listed as a row heading for what will become my pivot table. Then I'll put a check mark on quantity, and because that's a numeric field, it aggregates or sums the quantity and makes that the data that constitutes the body of my pivot table. So you could actually stop here and say you have a pivot table, albeit a very simple one. And in fact, if this is all I wanted, I could have just as easily done subtotals on the data and not had to build a pivot table at all. But let's make some adjustments here. First, I'm going to turn on the formatting that I want in this column. So I'm going to right click and go to number format. I won't choose format cells, as that would only format the cell where I had right clicked, but number format will format the cells in a way that will travel with the data as my pivot table changes its size and shape. So I'm going to turn on the we'll do the number style here with 1,000 separator but no decimal points. So now it's got a comma every 3 digits and no decimal points. So that's the format that I want. But I'd like to add some additional data to do further analysis. So let's see how these salespeople have sold to different customers. Let's put a check mark on the customer field. And so now within each salesperson, I see the customer reflected. So I see each customer for Chris, each one for Glenn, etc., etc. Now what has happened, because I'm repeating my customer names within the headings for each salesperson, my pivot table has become rather tall, making me have to scroll up and down to see the data. And I've got all this unused space to the right. So I'm going to take my customer field down here in the lower right hand corner of the screen where I've got my different panes, and I'll click and hold on customer and drag that field into the column labels section and release. So now the customer names go across rather than down. So I have the same data, but it's in a much more compact format, easier to read, and I don't have to do any scrolling. So assembling the pivot table is all about deciding where data goes. Do we have column labels or row labels? And let's say we want to add the sales month. Maybe I'd like to segment this data on a monthly basis. So when I put a check mark on sales month, again, it puts those months in, and just based on the randomness of the way I enter my data, it doesn't have 12 months for every salesperson, and that's fine. This tells me something about my data, right? It tells me what months different salespeople were working. But it has still made my pivot table rather tall. So what I might want to do, instead of making that a column label within the customers, which would make it rather wide, let's take a look at that. If I put sales month as a sub-column label, now for Boston Market, I've got all those months, and then I'd have to scroll to the right and then eventually see Capital Grill, etc. So that's not really effective. What I'm going to do is take sales month and drag it into the pane called Report Filter. So now that it's a report filter, I can still take a look at the months and filter on them, but it doesn't repeat throughout the entire body of my pivot table. So let's say I'm only interested in the first quarter. I'll hit a drop down, and starting with Excel 2007, you can use a report filter and select multiple values. So I'll choose select multiple values. I will uncheck select all and just check January, February, and March. And when I click OK, then that's the data I'm looking at in my pivot table. Now let's say I'm only interested in looking at King Crab and Boston Market. So over on the right hand side, which by the way, notice the funnel or filter icon next to sales month. Because I filtered that in my pivot table, it's indicating that that column's been filtered over here on the right in my field list. But I'm going to do a drop down on customer, which I can do in the body of the pivot table or over here in the field list, which is what I've come to prefer. So I'm going to put a drop down here, and I will uncheck select all and just do Boston Market and King Crab and click OK. And I have now narrowed down my selection. So I'm now looking at Boston Market and King Crab for just the first quarter of the year. One of the other things we like about the pivot table is that I can now drill down on one of these numbers. So let's say that after inspecting this, I see that Stewie had phenomenal sales at King Crab. So I will double click on that number, the 310,177, and when I double click it, it actually creates a new worksheet in my workbook showing Stewie's sales to King Crab. So I now can see from my original list of 10,000 rows of data, I can see the rows that were consisting of Stewie's sales to King Crab, which I can see there were 120. So when I double clicked on that number from my pivot table, which was the 310,177, it created a new sheet showing me 120 rows of data for that person. And I could then filter this data further. So maybe I now want to take Stewie's sales to King Crab and just see how he did in a particular city. So it puts that drill down data into a regular table so I could do filtering. So maybe I want to look at those sales in just Chicago and Houston and click OK, and I've now narrowed that down. Or maybe I just want to see the sales that he did to King Crab through the catering channel. So I turn on catering, and now I have just that subset of data. And of course, when we have a regular Excel table, I can, on my design tab, opt to turn on the total row, which will summarize the data at the bottom. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my pivot table, and that's my pivot table exercise, or at least the first one that we'll do. So in our next example, we'll look at slicing the data up a bit further, and we'll have a third video where we do pivot table charts, and a fourth where we will actually put calculations in the pivot table. Thanks for tuning in. I hope to see you again soon. Have a productive day.